Welcome everyone to our third lecture in the Public Squares series, and today we're going to be focusing on policy engagement. And so when we did the needs assessment, this was actually one of the most popular workshop topics out of all of them. And so we're going to be running this event now and also again on 19th of November. So today we're focusing on the lecture. 19th of November we'll have a lecture and a workshop. So today we're going to be looking at policy engagements and research, at practicing policy engagements in the context of transdisciplinary research, and then we're also going to unpack some challenges and recommendations. So I'll be doing the policy engagements and research part, and Gill will do most of the rest. So policy engagement is a very broad term that has come to mean many different things. And so in this lecture, we're going to focus on unpacking these different meanings and looking at what relevance it has to our work as transdisciplinary researchers. And I'm sure we all know that, when you're looking at grant proposals and within the university environment, there's more and more emphasis on policy engagements. And we expect it to do the kind of research that informs policy and practice. So it's important for us to understand what this is and how we can go about achieving it. And the outcome of policy engagement is often an indicator for assessing research impact and even research success. So it's a really important part of our work as researchers. But before we even start, we need to look at the different types of policy engagement that exists to understand where we want to go with our research. So we can look at policy engagement can comprise of government policy, research funding policies, policies of global organizations or institutions or university policies. There's so many different levels of policy when you start looking at that term. And in the picture we have here, you can see on the one hand you've got the scholar with the knowledge in the book, and then you've got a bridge. On the other side you have practice, and policy engagement for me is that bridge. So it's finding a way to move from knowledge within the academy to bring it to the place of practice and policy making, and seeing how we can influence the knowledge that we generate. How can that influence policy and practice? So where do you start? So it's quite daunting. Where do you start? And so we suggest that you start by policy mapping and starting to set your agenda. So, and the first point of departure would be to think about, what do you want to change? Broadly through your public square, what is your broad goal? Would it be finding a better way to identify and map missing unidentified persons, or what is it maybe gender policy change? But even before you get to the policy stage, you need to think about what is the broad goal of your work. And then once you've got that, the theme and the area that you want to change, you start to map policies. What kind of policies exist already in relation to that broad subject area, and then start to identify what is missing, where are the gaps. And then from there you can decide, do you want to inform or change an existing policy or policies, or do you actually need to create a completely new policy? And then if your policy, for example, is related to government policy, so that's the area you want to go into. Once you've identified that broad area of policy making, you need to then start to unpack that area and look at how the government structures work, because there's no point, if it's a local policy, there's no point heading and targeting policymakers at a national level. So in this picture here, you can see we've taken from Stellenbosch municipality. There are 3 different tiers of government. Can you see it from the national government? So you've got the national government, 3 different levels of government. You've got national government, provincial government, and local government. So you need to understand how these different structures work, and which tiers of governments and which directorates or departments are accountable in your research domain and have the power to change the way things are done. Where do you need to target your efforts? Essentially, we need to remember, and this carries on a bit from our last workshop and our last thematic area of mapping stakeholders, is that engaging with policy is actually engaging with people. We're not talking to pieces of paper or reports. We need to work with people, and the people specifically who sit in the policy space that you aim to influence. So in addition to mapping out the different policies you want to change and working out where those policies sit, you need to say, well, who has powers and who holds the power in those different spaces? And who can influence policy in response to research findings? And who are the people representing government departments or directorates that can influence policy in response to research findings? So it's really important that you start to identify those people. And some of the teams who engaged in the previous workshop have already started to map that out. That if you want to do that in your own time, we can also help you to do that, and working on a matrix to see which policymakers do you need to work with in response to the particular question. And then you also need to decide how and when to establish and strengthen relationships with these people. It's obviously important in the beginning to start working with them, but at what points in your project do you think you need to start forming these connections and strengthening these connections and sharing information? So in the picture over here, it's taken from, I took this some years ago at a policy dialogue with local stakeholders where we were working in rural KwaZulu-Natal to challenge the policy of early and forced marriages. And we had many different stakeholders in the room. Around the perimeter of the room, we had policy posters made by the young women who were affected by this problem. And then we had police, we had local NGOs, local government representatives, and then we were holding dialogues around this issue. So that's an example of a policy engagement exercise. But in this case, we were targeting quite a broad group to try and unpack this complicated problem. That's an example of a policy engagement event. There are many different ways that you can go about policy engagement. And these processes can actually change during the course of your project. You might start with seminars and events like you saw, or policy briefs, could be stories. So there are many different ways to facilitate that policy making, and you might even find that you need to change as you go along to see what's working. So that's my contribution so far, and then Gill's going to now speak to you about the practice of policy engagements in the context of transdisciplinary research.
Thank you, Astrid. So to go on to this topic of policy engagement in the context of transdisciplinary research, I'm going to start with a case study. And the Water and Fire was a 3-year participatory action research project that ran from 2020 through to 2022. It was funded by the UK RIGCRF, and the fieldwork was led by Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, which is the non-profit organisation that I co-direct and co-founded in 2010. And the transdisciplinary nature of the Water and Fire project was underpinned by its core objectives to have institutional researchers working closely in partnership with affected community members for the purposes of co-production and policy engagement. And Water and Fire was very much a solutions-orientated exploration of disaster risk reduction and resilience in the context of 3 climate-related hazards, specifically fire outbreaks, flooding, and water shortage. And in generating the best bets, or these solutions, these potential solutions for adaptation to these environmental hazards, we worked with people living in 3 communities in Cape Town that were frequently and harshly affected by these environmental hazards. So Overcome Heights was the case study site for fire, Sweet Home Farm was the case study site for flooding, and Delft was the case study site for water shortage. And Overcome Heights and Sweet Home Farm are deeply informal settlements, and Delft is a very large township located close to the airport here in Cape Town, and indeed not far from where we are at the BMRI. And importantly, SLF had worked in all of these sites previously, and we had well-established connections or networks to tap into. And this included working with a well-established neighbourhood watch group in Delft, which I think, as you know, is a notoriously now dangerous part of our city. And so Astrid mentioned engaging with people, and before beginning this research, we needed to have approval from the City of Cape Town municipality. And through an existing partnership that the Sustainable Livelihoods had with a community safety organisation called the Safety Lab, we were introduced to Gareth Morgan. And Gareth Morgan is the Executive Director of Future Planning and Resilience at the City of Cape Town. And Gareth was very supportive of the objectives of the Water and Fire project, and he provided the necessary approvals for the proposal and the actual implementation of the research after we had won the grant. So Gareth Morgan had also been very instrumental in the development of the 2019 Cape Town Resilience Strategy. And one of our aims with the Water and Fire project was to take up the strategic goal 5.2.5, which is to engage in inclusive public participation processes that empower Cape Townians, with the aim of informing resilience action and to strengthen the next version of this strategy with the inclusion of community voices. And that connection with the Safety Lab and that introduction to Gareth Morgan, who obviously had a very powerful position in the city, was absolutely vital to gain the approvals that we needed and to have a strong connection into local government. So this study took a mixed methods approach, and we started with a household survey of about 600 adults that were distributed across the 3 sites, the 3 research sites. And this survey was conducted as a baseline overview to generate statistics on, for example, household demographics, living conditions, and individual perceptions of these 3 environmental hazards that we were studying. And the survey also aided the selection of community-based co-researchers that we went on to work with, as well as helping to inform focal points for the next phase of inquiry in this research, Water and Fire research project. And the next phase of inquiry was a participatory visual methods process, and it comprised digital storytelling, community mapping, and photo voice. And these 3 methods actively involved community members from the 3 sites as community-based co-researchers. And these community-based co-researchers worked individually and collectively to generate, to analyse, to interpret and to present their own data. And their data was generated in response to a series of open-ended research questions that were applied through the layered application of these 3 visual methods. So there was a progressive inquiry happening. So the resulting short videos that they made, the photographs that they took, and the hand-drawn maps that they created served as both information for analysis, so data for analysis, and electronic or hard copy visual materials that could be used for presentation and exhibition at the engagement events that were the next part of this work. So these compilations of visual data were analysed in 2 key phases, and importantly they were analysed by the community-based co-researchers in workshops that were facilitated by the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation research team. And the first phase of data analysis led to the formulation of 17 best bets, and these best bets are broad, overarching solutions for managing environmental disaster risk in these types of settings. These research settings, Overcome Heights, Sweet Home Farm and Delft, and places like that. And the second phase of analysis unpacked these overarching best bets into much more detailed potential interventions that communicated what types of interventions were needed, why these interventions are needed, where they are needed, who's responsible for implementing them, and the mechanisms through which implementation could happen. So that was all of that thinking, all of that unpacking, and all of coming up with these ideas was done by the community-based co-researchers with facilitation support from our research team. And I just want to point out that an extremely valuable phase of the Water and Fire project was the time and resources that we put in to co-designing, practicing and preparing for the policy engagement event. So we partnered with another organisation that specialised in facilitating policy engagement, and this organisation helped to mentor the community-based co-researchers in being able to clearly articulate their calls for change, whilst showing the data they had produced as research evidence. And this mentorship was vitally important for the community-based co-researchers, as most of them did not have any experience of interacting with policymakers, academics, or even other members of their own community on the topic of managing environmental disaster risk. And part of the mentorship process included supporting the co-researchers through the process of choosing what data is it that you want to present, and how and which people within your group would be the best to present that data. So that was all part of this process of practicing and preparing for the policy engagement that was to come. And then came the main policy engagement event of the project. It was called the Co-Production Towards Urban Resilience in Daba, and it took place in September 2022, so 2 years ago already, time flies, in Philippi Village. And the co-researchers from all three research settings were in attendance. All of them from all three settings were in attendance, along with invited community members. Officials from multiple government departments were there, academics from various different institutions were there, and representatives from the NGO sector. And the co-researchers led the large majority of the presentations at this event, which involved showing their stories, their maps, and their photographs that they had collectively selected as the most powerful examples of their own lived experience. And then after sharing this visual data, they then presented the best bets that they had come up with, that they had formulated through this process in the form of summary tables and infographics. And these presentations were then followed by roundtable discussions, with one roundtable being held for each of the three environmental disaster risks. And each roundtable was attended by the full range of stakeholders at the event. So we had community-based co-researchers, other community members, academics, people in government and NGO representatives at each of the three roundtables. And the documents that were on the table were the best bets and the more detailed intervention strategies that had been developed. And so on this slide, you can see the overarching best bets to address water shortage that were being deliberated at this particular round table that you see in the photograph. And this activity really fostered lively conversation, and everybody around the table had an opportunity to speak. And the conversations that were being had at the roundtable discussions really circulated around the possibilities and obstacles of the various interventions that were being proposed. So what was it possible for the City of Cape Town to do, and what was it not, and why, and where were the problems, so that people could really understand each other's perspectives and points of views, and why these best bets were being proposed, and then the possibilities and obstacles that stood in the way of either the possibility of implementing them or not. So this is a quote from Yusuf Mohammed, who is a civil engineer in water and sanitation in the City of Cape Town. And he said, "What I've experienced here is enlightening. Listening to the whole video that the women presented through pictures, it's giving us real data on the ground. We want to do more, but I think it's just for the community to understand the city's challenges so that there can be a constructive dialogue between us." Thokozani Narushe, who works in the Western Cape government in the Department of Policy and Research, said, "I think with greater participation in meetings with City, in calling for ministers and other powerful politicians to sit with them, I think you'll find that people become more confident in the way they engage with powerful structures." Shanaz Kasim Musa, a resilience analyst also in the city, "There's such a lot of energy at these sessions and a group of people who want to positively affect society, and I think that's amazing. And it's also given me a sense of hope." And Lynn Worship, who works in public awareness and education for the City of Cape Town, says, "What's been done in this community is incredible. I would love to be part of it as far as I can, so that we can action these plans that these community members have put together, and we are on par with their safety." So just drawing the case study to an end then, we've published quite a few papers already. The top 4 there are the papers we've already published, but I wanted to draw your attention to the paper that's been submitted to the journal Evidence and Policy, which is specifically on the topic of policy engagement, and the title is Policy Engagement Through Empowered Representation, Democratic Mediation and a Participatory Research Project on Climate Resilience. And that is, it's gone to the journal, it's come back, we've made some revisions, and we're hoping it's going to be published really soon. We'll be sure to let you know when it is. But also, I know that this is being recorded, so all of these resources are going to be made available to everybody in the public squares. And if you wanted to know more about this particular project, the Water and Fire Project, it has its own dedicated website, and there's a 20-minute film on YouTube. If you just type in the Water and Fire Project on YouTube, you'll find it, and it's a 20-minute film that takes you right through the process of the project, including the build-up and the preparation for the policy engagement events, and then these responses from the officials from the different departments that attended. So by its very nature, transdisciplinary research generates multiple types, different types of data, and that's its top strength. This is what makes transdisciplinary research great. And I've given an example of the way that a mixed methods data was presented in the Water and Fire Project, but the Public Squares projects are likely to generate much more diverse and complex data sets than the Water and Fire Project did. And this, as well as being its greatness and its strength, also poses a substantial challenge with the field of transdisciplinary research, because how do you assemble all this data as evidence from often very different types of audiences? So you've got many different audiences who may be interested in your data, but how do you assemble it? How do you package it and present it to make it accessible? And particularly in the on today's topic, for policy audiences, especially given the fact that policy engagement opportunities are notoriously limited for time. And one example of how this can be done is through the generation of infographics. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples here. So this infographic is on scaling depression treatment for women in sub-Saharan Africa. And immediately you see a big number, 66 million women in sub-Saharan Africa suffer from depression, and 85% of those women have no access to effective treatment. So these are big numbers, and they're clear, and they're bold, and they're striking, and they're meaningful. And you can present this and people immediately get information which is important and that they can take away with them. And this one also really struck me as something quite remarkable, because where does all the world's food go? And how much food do we make, and where does it all go? And I'm sorry if this is not very clear on the screen, but basically, I mean, this is looking at what different types of food there are and where it goes in the world, and what percentages of food goes to different countries and different contexts in the world. And this has obviously been an enormous data set, and I'm sure this data has come from many, many different sources and is made up of many, many different types of data. But what they have done here is they have condensed that data into this beautiful visual that you can see. You can look at this for 5 minutes and you get an enormous amount of very, very important information in a very short space of time. So it's just an example of this use of infographics, and I think it is a very a great possibility for policy engagement, to ease your policy engagement processes. So coming on to challenges and recommendations, just from the front of my mind, I think it's really important in research to start out with the recognition that it is very unlikely that your project alone is going to lead to a change in policy or practice anytime soon. Because the wheels of government or the wheels of policy decision-making bodies in general turn very slowly. You know, there's layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy, and policy making itself is an incredibly complex and complicated process that we're not going to touch on today. But you can always be assured that the very least that you will do with your research data is to make them think. And I came across this nice post here. So Dume, who's working in South Africa with many colleagues in South Africa, have made a valuable contribution to understanding key challenges at this science, policy and society intersection through this post. And it's being published on the i2insights.org website. And what these authors have done is they've analysed 5 projects that have been implemented in 9 African cities, including 3 cities in South Africa, that were part of the Leading Integrated Research Programme, or LIRA, for Agenda 2030 in Africa. And through their analysis, the authors have defined 5 central challenges for transdisciplinary research that aims to co-produce knowledge across academic disciplines, across policy contexts, and across societal domains. And the findings that have been shared in this post build on that findings that they had published previously in a 2021 paper in the Journal of Environmental Science and Policy, which is coming up as a resource in the next few slides. And I'm just going to summarise their key findings because, well, they're very resonant with my own experience, the wider experience of the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation in policy engagement, and also other published resources on this topic. So, challenge number 1 is what they have termed as conceptual threshold crossing. So conceptual threshold crossing in terms of intellectual, ontological and cognitive transformation is particularly challenging when projects are not just about understanding problems or raising awareness, but about true co-production of knowledge and co-ownership of the resulting outcomes. And this challenge becomes exacerbated as diversity increases. So the more diverse the academic disciplines, the policy context and the societal domains of the people who are involved, the greater the conceptual thresholds that have to be crossed. And this challenge is further exacerbated when past experience in integrative research projects is limited. So the less exposure the people who are doing the transdisciplinary research have to the other sectors, the more difficult it's going to be to cross these conceptual thresholds. Challenge number 2 is resource use intensity. So inadequate availability of resources such as time, human resources and funds can pose significant challenges. The frequency and intensity of engagement between science, policy and societal actors is costly in terms of, for example, scheduling meetings and finding suitable and accessible venues for such meetings, as well as time. So it's often difficult to schedule meetings that suit all critical actors, and trying to find common ground, which often shifts as projects progress, can impede the pace of project implementation. Challenge number 3 is power differentials, values and ethics. And science-society policy interactions have inherent power differentials. So academic actors, for example, are epistemically powerful in the academic discourse of projects, whereas policy actors are influential in determining whether project outcomes get to be used in the policy arena. And the influence of power and diverse values becomes even stronger in projects that are implemented in contested spaces, and this requires tactful balancing of interests, values and power dynamics. And they say that all say that particularly important is to ensure that the voices of less powerful actors are not only captured, but are also reflected in project implementation and outcomes. Challenge number 4 is walking the last mile, and the authors use the analogy of walking the last mile to illustrate the importance of ensuring that discontinuity and participation fatigue are adequately managed. This ensures that the interests of critical actors in projects are sustained from co-identification of research problems through co-production and dissemination. And their experience suggests that discontinuity and participation fatigue are inevitable. They recommend building enough redundancy into projects across science, policy and society domains as an important strategy for coping with and adapting to discontinuity. And what they mean by redundancy here is embedding multiple actors who could play the same or similar roles, so helping to minimise the negative effects of discontinuity of people or ideas. And then challenge number 5, a history of academic and practice silos. So for academics who haven't previously participated in transdisciplinary research projects and knowledge co-production, integration is often a particular challenge. The integration challenge can manifest as conceptual, practical and or methodological. And policy actors as well often have a history of working in silos with little collaboration across different policy sectors, and there can be a lack of collaboration across different levels of government, such as local and national government. And the lack of, just coming back to the water and fire project, something that I personally experienced in my own policy engagement efforts in that project was this working in silos. So I'd speak to somebody in the Department of Water and Sanitation, and they would say, I can't speak to you about that. That doesn't fall within my department. You're going to have to go and talk to somebody in human settlements. And then I'd get a conversation going with somebody in human settlements, and we'd get to a certain point and they'd say, oh no, I can't speak to you about that. That's not in my department. You need to go now and speak to somebody in waste management. And I'm thinking, but all of these things are so interconnected, and that it's just like passing from pillar to post. And so I came away from that project really thinking that, well, the whole of the city of Cape Town, with all due respect to the many, many good people that work very, very hard with all good intentions, that our, the city of Cape Town, for example, its local government needs to be completely restructured. And they need to be working in a much more interconnected, much more holistic way if they really want to address some of the biggest problems that we have in the city. And then, so some recommendations that they came up with, they say that challenges related to conceptual threshold crossing require openness and reflexive learning. It may be useful to tackle the challenge of resource intensiveness, history of silos and discontinuity and participation fatigue together, as together these challenges raise the imperative for making resources available for co-production. So specifically to mainstream science policy society interactions, Odemi and his colleagues suggest identifying sources of inherent power and the context of the exercise of power. So really thinking about power in your project and where it lies, making more explicit the often implicit assumptions, values and expectations that are held regarding stakeholder participation in a research project, addressing these silos through capability development and incentivising policymakers and practitioners by engaging them from the very beginning of the project right the way through implementation and evaluation, which is something that we also talked about in the stakeholder lecture, and then strengthening co-production through having adequate resources and, for example, project funding and mentorship. So further recommendations that are coming really just from my experience and my thinking, your transdisciplinary research team will be strengthened by including team members or collaborating with partners who are experienced in facilitating engaged research activities with multiple interest groups. It will also really help you to have people in your team who specifically play the role of policy engagement leads. So they become, that's a major job for them, and they become the go-to or contact people for your policy partners. It's a big, busy, important role, and it can't just be tacked on to, well, you're doing this job, and hey, why don't you also just be the policy engagement person as well? That's not going to work. If you want to have an ongoing relationship with government, you need to have somebody who is on it all the time. And I would suggest having somebody, for example, who's skilled in producing infographics that can effectively summarize the highlights of your multiple data and your very complex data sources. And this was a piece of advice that was given to me by a colleague who's got a lot of experience in policy engagement as well. He said, get yourself informed about what do your government partners need to see as evidence to help them push through the changes in policy that you want to see. So work with them, ask them, what do you need from us? What do you need from us? This is if you have a good relationship and you're developing a policy that they also want to see, then, find out from them what they need. What do they need to see? And in policy engagement events, make sure that everybody's there, all the research team members who have the in-depth knowledge of the different types of data that you're producing, so that if you get asked, they can speak to it knowingly and confidently. Present broad data, not nuanced data with give them big numbers, give them percentages. Percentages are very punchy and bring solutions, not just problems. And then a last recommendation that I would make is to build relationships with powerful media houses. So I'm giving the example here of Bekasiza. The Bekasiza Centre for Health Journalism is an independent media organisation specialising in narrative solutions journalism. In this case, they focus on health and social justice issues across Africa. And this is, so this means to scrutinise in isiZulu, and Astrid and I are going to be working, as it happens with this particular organisation, in a climate change and mental health project that we're both involved in across Africa. But I think this is also really, and I think this is going to help us a lot in terms of raising awareness around the impacts of climate change on mental health on our continent. So I'm just a few resources here. I'm not going to go through these one by one. I think these resources are all very much on topic, and if you are to delve into them, then clearly they will give you a lot more other resources that you can go to. This top one here, The Researcher's Guide to Influencing Policy by Mark Reed, is brand new, and it's actually currently only available for pre-order, but it's coming out later this month. Something from my own work on food systems in South Africa with colleagues from UWC, and then the paper Biodumi in environmental sciences, which they used to really draw out the challenges that I have described to you earlier on, and then another couple of papers there, which I think could be worth looking at. So policy engagement is also a chapter in this course, an Introduction and Practical Guide to Community Engagement Involvement in Global Health Research, which was launched on the Global Health Network in May this year, so very recently. And there's 2 modules which could be helpful: justifying community engagement and involvement, considering stakeholders and engaging policymakers, and then module 6, which is on partnerships, relationships and project planning. And this online training course, Fast Track Impact, is a website, and one of the main elements on this site is around policy engagement and research. And they have a whole host of different training courses and a whole lot of different written resources as well on this topic. And this is the Mark Reed, whose book is just coming out. He's very instrumental in the Fast Track Impact space. And then the information is beautiful, which is essentially about how to make infographics. How do you create effective, interesting, and impactful data, visualizations, and infographics? And there's actually a number of books that have come out on the information is beautiful. It is also a website, and there are a number of different books. This was the first one that was published in a series on creating beautiful data. So, Astrid, do you want to wrap us up with a teaser for the workshop in November?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So this is a slide that we showed a bit earlier, and we just wanted to re-show it now as a teaser to get you guys thinking about the workshop and the idea about setting your agenda. So to start thinking about what do you want to change through your public square. I mean, there might be many things, but just if you can just identify one broad goal at this point and what policies exist in relation to that goal. And then through that policy mapping exercise to see what is missing and what do we want to change. Do we want to change an existing policy or inform a policy, or do we need a whole new policy to address this issue? And then so that's the homework we'd like you guys to start working on before the workshop. Even if you have meetings as a public square or on your own, to start thinking about this, and in your spare time, start mapping out the policies that you want to influence. So thank you. I wanted to open up for questions. So Wolfgang's got one.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely valuable. Thank you so much. We will get the slides with the links and stuff. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yes, we can do that. Yeah.
Just a few comments, if I may. So, and I think the challenge comes with working in an interdisciplinary field and actually investigating something which falls in between these silos. I found it interesting that you struggled with the city of Cape Town.
Yeah.
I mean, we are here in a little paradise in the Western Cape and the city. I don't have many professional dealings with the city, but a lot with the province. And I must say, this is actually almost always a rigged experience. I mean, these guys are there. They know where the issue is. They listen. They are receptive. They do stuff as much as they can, and they seem to, for me, it is also totally confusing. Who's dealing with what? But there are people who know and who bring in others from different departments or whatever it's called that may play a role. So overall, that's been a very positive experience. I had a few other touches with policy makers. And that was sort of national advisory committees and stuff. But those are the people that you know from your work. So, I mean, I'm competent in the health space when it comes to infectious diseases. I don't deal with hypertension. But, infectious disease, I know to speak to, and then they refer you on. But where I see a real challenge is now working in between. And that becomes very confusing. In fact, I would even say that you can map out what there is in terms of treatment guidelines, like say, or management guidelines for certain diseases. No, I don't know, that's one I feel. You know these anyway. I mean, that's our daily tool. So you know what needs to be changed, and that's very targeted. But I don't know one in agriculture or in other fields that I don't even know exist or what they are responsible for. And that is very challenging for me. I mean, I struggle to, even if I know that our Department of Agriculture has to approve of this, that, and the other, just to find it. And then they change the name again. Then the current website doesn't work and you won't need them. And you don't even find something if you know it's there. And it's only a question of finding it, let alone sort of, am I able to explore the specs to see, what is there, what are they responsible for? I feel I'm drowning under an avalanche of nonsense and unrelated stuff and broken links and so that. I think that's actually something else.
Another challenge.
But I think the consortia should probably, if they aim to do something, they should also have people for each section or for each sphere that know the policy landscape, because we find that very difficult just to know even under whom that falls. And sometimes it changes because the departments get relegated to another ministry or whatever. That is awful. So I mean, comfortable in my own little space, but beyond, I find that difficult. And of course, on the national basis, then you have these different. So some things are on the provincial level, others are on the national level. It gets very confusing for me. I wouldn't say so. I found it a bit alarming when you say that even at the city level, it's difficult. So it'll only become more complex. So my suggestion would be that there is somebody takes on the role of not sure what to call it, maybe the rapporteur for policies or the legal landscape. In fact, I have found a few times that some legislation was out for comment affecting us, and a few times we caught it sort of almost at the last moment or not at all. And and I've engaged through the university, and they are helpful but can't really help. I mean, they're at the time, but they can't really help. So I don't even know what's out there for commenting. If I don't pick it up by some news release or something, it just
Hard to even know.
got these things I need to comment. It's not say TikTok because they got somebody to write it for them who wrote it for himself. But and then it goes out, and there's not a strong enough group like industries. I mean, they of course jump up and down and influence this, but it's don't even know it is out there. So there's some really stupid stuff asked in law, and then there are these different levels of laws and stuff. So very difficult for the non-lawyer, and that doesn't seem to be a good mechanism to sort of like an alert system where you can say anything to do with virus and or infection, bring it to my attention. There isn't, because it's a scanned photograph of the government cassette or something, which is like unreadable for the average risk.
No,
It's a real gap.
there is a gap. I just want to see, Karen said, to what extent do you think funders and funding sources are helping to enable this way of working, which necessarily requires a lot more funds and time allocated towards relationships, partnerships, engagement, etc. So it's funders and funding sources. So what?
So so I would say that it feels like there is more and more call for researchers to be doing policy engagement at some level. But it also sometimes feels like a little bit of a tick box. So there's maybe a 300 or 250, 500 words, if you're very lucky, word section on a proposal that asks, how are you going to engage policy? And then you say, all the right things. But it still sometimes feels like it's a little bit of a tick box, and there's not necessarily always accountability for policy engagement in research. And I think it itself is a topic for research. But I also think it's a great opportunity for researchers to be doing some evaluation and then feeding back to the funder about where they came across challenges in doing policy engagement and why they needed more time, or why they simply didn't have enough resources to be able to really do policy engagement well. I hope that answers your question.
I think, we have budgets. So in the budget, when you're writing up your funding, your proposal and budget, list of activities, if you have a list of activities that are dedicated towards policy engagement, and maybe even, as Wolfgang was saying, maybe you need to have a dedicated person on the team who knows a bit about policies and legal, with a legal background, so that you could actually fund a percentage of that person's time to help you to really effectively map policies, people, because it's not, it can be very time consuming, especially if you're chasing websites that have crashed and people that have changed and departments that have changed names and position, and it seems frustrating, really. And so there could be something to consider when one starts funding a project, to put that on your activities and your personnel costs as well. Human resources costs. I think that's a good point. Thanks a lot for this enlightening presentation, very clear and useful. My two comments, based on experience, if ever useful to your discussion. One is about the difficulty to align research results with policy needs, not only the overall content, but the specific results and their format. For instance, a cost-benefit analysis could be done in various ways, and one may not satisfy the needs of the specific policies. This is often neglected. Another is about the accountability of researchers who may not provide sufficiently robust results and yet would not face consequence, as opposed to practitioners, stakeholders, and policymakers. This is often ignored, yet would potentially inform and modify research practices. At least the first issue can be dealt to some extent with transdisciplinarity, science as you define it, with co-construction, etc. I suppose, to align research results with policy needs would be as an idea of co-construction. So if you can engage policymakers from the beginning, and that's something we need to start doing in this program, to start finding ways to, once you've mapped those stakeholders, to start as much as possible to bring in stakeholders and policymakers as stakeholders into the discussion so we can identify what are the needs. And I'm sure you've done that with the Science for Justice project. Yes, you have. I mean, you know that there's this huge number of missing and unidentified people, and there's a need to identify who they are so that for burials and all those other, so save money for the government. So there you got your government's interest, so there'll be many ways of doing that. So I think good research and co-construction from the beginning. And the other one is the presentation of the results. So maybe what Gill said about infographics can help in looking at what's worked in the past, big percentages if you have, but of course that data needs to be scientifically valid. So making sure that you're not spreading misinformation. And then, so Bridget just said thank you. Are there any other questions before we close? I had a couple, just for Gill. So I was wanting to ask, I thought that was really interesting what you said about training the community-based co-researchers. So if you're having co-researchers involved in the project and helping to present policy results, you said there was an organization that helped to train them, and I thought that was really quite ingenious. So who was that and how did they do it?
So we worked with an organization called the Safety Lab, and they understand you because you're okay. Sorry, we worked with an organization called the Safety Lab, and they were very used to participating in policy engagement processes, especially around community safety and violence. And they had worked with done a lot of community work. And so rather than us taking on that extra role, we invited the Safety Lab to come and do the mentorship, because they were used to working with community members, because they were used to working in the policy engagement space. And we knew them from working together with them previously, and we knew that they would do a good job. So that was really helpful, and it helped us to bring on that expertise. And it didn't take a lot of time. It really just took a few days, but it was time so well spent, because when we went into those policy engagement events with the community-based co-researchers, they felt ready. They were excited, and they were also confident to present their data and to enter into discussions with people who would normally probably be quite intimidating for them to meet and talk to.
Yeah, that's good. And I also wanted to ask, I mean, you spoke about the power of percentages, but I was thinking about the power of human stories on the other side. So I know you said that percentages are usually more hard-hitting, punchy, that's it. But I know you shared some of the digital stories with me yesterday around the other project, and I found the excerpts from those narratives are really powerful as well. And as well as having the co-researchers in the room with policymakers, I think it's that human element that can also drive change and connection, because percentages alone can just be a little bit almost alienating, and Brown doesn't actually understand what does it really mean. What does that mean for the people?
No,
what impact? What is the sort of the knock-on impact of that? If you saw those, was it 88% of women who've been diagnosed with depression in Africa, sub-Saharan, don't have access to prescription to medicines. What does that mean for their families and for their productivity and for for themselves and their ability to reach their potential? So I think that human stories can also have
absolutely, and I think it all comes down to a matter of time. How much time do you have for the policy engagement? Do you need to make your point very quickly, or do you have the luxury of maybe a half a day where you can show infographics and stories and other types of data as well? And in the water and fire policy engagement event, we were lucky in that we had a half-day event. So we could do all the presentations, we could show stories, maps, photographs, the best bets, and have these breakaway discussions. But to get all of those policymakers around the table for half a day to come out to Philippi Village, which is also a notoriously risky part of Cape Town, we were very, very fortunate. But we worked very hard to make it happen, and we had a whole team involved in making sure that process happened well. So I agree with you completely. I think the example of infographics is just given as a way that if you have very, very little time and you want to make a big point, then you can use infographics. But if you can combine them with, other types of data, and exactly as you said, stories. And the stories, I mean, you could feel the shift in the room when the stories were being shown, the digital stories, and not just, it was because the people who had actually had those experiences and told those stories were presenting them themselves. That took it to that really takes it to the next level. So yes.
And maybe you could have a quote on the infographic from the powerful story. Anyway, but thank you, Gill. Thank you, everyone. We're going to leave now.